Some called it Judgment Day. Some called it Armageddon. It took a while before anyone called them zombies. We just didn't want to face the truth, I think. Murder happens all the time. Even vicious, brutal murders hardly rate a headline in the morning news these days. A few random murders, however grisly, didn't arouse real concern at first. As a society, we had become largely inoculated against such brutality. Daily, it seemed, another child was taken, sometimes found raped, sometimes found murdered, and more nefariously, some would claim, never found at all. We told ourselves that it had happened somewhere else. It happened to someone else. Never here, never to us. But sometimes, it did. It had become a backdrop to our waking lives. The milk carton kids had been replaced by walls of the missing in the vestibules of big box stores. Rarely did anyone pause to look. But for those with missing people, life was an excruciating exercise in stasis, always waiting to hear of news or breaks in the case, unable to breathe, unable to move. But there was always hope. People clung to hope against astronomical odds that their loved ones would be found. After all, several children, some now adults, had been recovered following a rescue or an escape. Their tales of captivity were dire, however. Who could argue that they would prefer never to know than to have them back? But it gave false hope to millions and prolonged the agony of the bereaved. Hanging on was a kind of living death in itself. Then, the reports started coming in. It began as a trickle, which quickly grew into a flood of sightings coming into 911, America's most wanted call centers, police stations, radio stations, to whoever would listen, that this child or that young woman was spotted. I can't be sure, but she was definitely wearing the same clothes as on the posters. And it can't be him after all these years, but it looks just like him. Servers crashed, operators were overwhelmed, and there was widespread disbelief at first. But soon enough, the evidence mounted. It was impossible. It was incredible. But however you cut it, there was no denying that missing people, many presumed dead from all over the world, had come back. People tried to approach them, but the zombies were unresponsive to discourse. So many missing people had come back that people took to calling them the returned instead of zombies. They were the lost ones, the ones we had hoped would be recovered alive, but never really believed they would be. They had come back, but they were not the same. They were filthy and lethargic. They didn't or couldn't interact with others or their surroundings. They seemed disconnected from the world. None of them spoke, nor showed any recognition of those around them. In fact, they didn't seem to communicate in any way. They were unnerving in their catatonia, and although they seemed to have a destination in mind, whether or not they actually had a mind was debatable. Yes, they had come back, and they seemed to have somewhere to go, for no placations or pleas from the living would stay them from their journey for long. They would eventually amble on, inexorable and unwavering, shuffling towards destinations unknown. Something had returned, but what these things were and what they wanted was a mystery. But they were not the people that we knew. They were alien and alienated, foreign to our hearts, and they carried the odor of rot about them. From shallow graves and swamps they rose. Some of them clawed their way from cemeteries and churchyards. From vast fields and shuttered basements they came. Somehow, they had become imbued with a powerful, unnatural will to seek out something or someone. It was truly terrifying to see them shuffling up the high road and down the lane, doggedly pressing on to untold destinations. Then, the first reports that they were killing people came in. They were unlike the zombies of cinema, however. These were not flesh-crazed, slavering automatons, hungering endlessly for entrails and brains, as envisioned by Romero. No. The returned actually showed very little interest in consuming what they killed. Their main objective was clearly to kill, and there was substantial evidence of ripping and chewing, but it was more likely a result of the returned having only their hands and teeth for weapons. There were no indications that they consumed what they killed. Mastication was a means to an end. They did not kill indiscriminately. They were very specific about who lived and who died. Among those targeted by the returned were policemen, politicians, lawyers, teachers, movie stars, mechanics, and convicted pedophiles. They were virtually from every walk of life. They seemed to share no common denominator, although they were almost exclusively male. Many of the victims were pillar of the community types, but nothing seemed to connect them. It was a popular television host who put forth the first tentative guesses at what lay behind the mystery of the returned and those they selected to die. He knew the meaning of loss and tragedy better than nearly anyone, and it was he, with his dark adapted eyes, who saw past the veneer of legitimacy of these men and few women, and began to connect the dots. It was this icon of the missing, speaking from retirement, who ventured the first credible theory for the gruesome deaths at the hands of the dead. His proclamation was met with dubious reception, but he was vindicated with a little help from a young journalist and blogger who illegally accessed the National Criminal Database and obtained a list of accused and convicted sex crime suspects, and it was he who presented overwhelming evidence that the targets of the returned were most likely responsible for their murders. Panic ensued. Hordes of men swamped the police stations, confessing to unsolved or in some cases unknown murders, sometimes confessing to crimes in which someone else had been convicted, confessing to anything that they could think of. All with one stipulation in mind: immediate remand. Jails had become the last refuge of the guilty, but prisons seemed to be the only true safe place for the wicked. Then, even these safe havens began to fail. There were rumors that the guards didn't have to fight too hard to keep the returned from gaining entrance, and there was a whisper or two of compliance. After it was realized that the returned were indiscriminate in their retribution, more and more of them accidentally made their way onto the max sec wards. How they gained entrance into the electronically locked cells is anyone's guess. Although, one fact is indisputable. Those tasked with the imprisonment of criminals may have had friends or relatives who were the victims of evil and are not necessarily opposed to a little justice being meted out on their behalf. In the beginning, there was fear, panic, and mayhem. But once it became apparent that the returned were not attacking at random and could not be provoked into violence, not even when savage themselves, we began to relax a bit. As time passed, we simply grew accustomed to them. We began leaving our homes and shelters, going about our business as usual, even while they shuffled ever onward. I saw one walk across a freeway once. Drivers slowed to allow it to pass. They were just part of the scenery, no more remarkable than a rock, or tree, or stump. Hindering them didn't work for long. Injuring them didn't work. Even shooting them didn't work. If they had so much as a single arm or leg in which to drag themselves along, they kept going. Patiently and emotionlessly, they just kept going. The old adage about getting them in the head was wrong. Some had clearly been killed via varying degrees of head trauma. Whatever force animated them didn't seem to rely on the central nervous system or an intact cranium. We relaxed because an image seen over and over will eventually lose its power to shock or alarm or to even inspire notice. We relaxed because they seemed to be on a mission. It was a mission of revenge, and we could live with that. I think some people even welcomed them. They were cleaning houses, as it were, doing for us what a proper democracy could never hope to accomplish. They were unerringly administering a biblical justice. An eye for an eye, and a life for a life. I think we actually started to feel safer. The most insidious threats to society were being removed, and oftentimes invisible threats that shared our homes and shared our beds. One could actually walk the streets at night. The returned were a far better deterrent to crime than the death penalty. Pleading couldn't save you from their justice. Money couldn't save you from their justice. It was horrifying at first, yes, but it was also satisfying. As far as we knew, they could never hurt an innocent person. They never made a mistake, but of course, eventually, all good things must be interfered with by the government. The people in charge began rounding them up, and what became of them after that, I don't know. But there were many, and they just kept coming. That was when the wife of the television host had died, killed on camera by the headless body of her young son. John had took a gun from his own bodyguard in the confusion and ended his life with a resounding bang, and not a soul could blame him. Shock and outcry were immediate. Possible explanations were more elusive. Speculation ran wild. Why her? Had she been involved in her son's death? She had never been seriously considered a suspect. Nothing in the media had ever pointed to her, and her grief and guilt at having left him unattended, albeit very briefly, were plaintive and wrenching. Their dramatic loss had played out across millions of televisions, and I can't even name a single person who questioned her innocence. The answers came soon enough, as more and more parents of murdered children began to be taken by the returned. It had become clear that they held those who had failed to protect them just as responsible as those who had kidnapped and murdered them. When this unfathomable concept began to sink in, many parents of murdered or missing children took their own lives. Their fates were sealed, convicted by their own hearts, long before they could be silently accused by the returned. There was little fanfare, although there was great sympathy. Many others simply resigned themselves to the inevitable and awaited their fates. They waited on lawn chairs and on stoops, on car bumpers and tire swings. They seemed to be everywhere. I never realized how many people had lost their children, having been tormented by their secret failures, for decades in some cases. These parents grimly and stoically welcomed their wayward child's final toothy embrace. Across the lonely expanse of years, I've prayed that she would find her way home. I've hoped for it, and I've dreaded it. Knowing the horrors that most children are subjected to when kidnapped, I berated myself. I hated myself. I blamed myself and blamed everyone else. I've made deals with God, and I've made deals with the devil if I had thought that he would keep his end. I've fantasized about it. I've mentally prepared feasts and homecomings and grave sites. I've imagined many scenarios, but this one that never occurred to me, seems to fit the best somehow. It fits my guilt and desire to be punished. You see, I sent her out to play that day because I was busy with chores, cooking, and laundry, busy with things that did not matter at all. The only thing that ever mattered was her, and I was just too preoccupied to know it. As for me, I'm going to await my end in my old rocking chair. I've left the kitchen door ajar for her, for my Ruth.